behalf of the University of La Verne, I am delighted to welcome you to the Bob and Mary Neher Lecture. Bob worked here at the university for more than 50 years. He's known as a mentor to so many people through the years and is known for his passion for the environment. Founded and helped fund the Bob and Mary Neher Montana Field Station, and as I understand it, he, along with students and other faculty, actually built it with his own hands. He's a valued member and a generous benefactor to the University of La Verne community, and we extend the warmest welcome and our deepest thanks that he's here with us tonight.
It is my pleasure to introduce Zelikova, our invited speaker for this year's 2024 Robert and Mary Neher Global Sustainability Lecture. Dr. Zelikova earned her PhD in ecological and evolutionary biology from the University of Colorado. She currently serves as director of Colorado State University's Soil Carbon Solutions Center, and is a joint faculty member in the Department of Soil and Crop Sciences. In her own words, Dr. Zelikova is a climate change scientist, advocate, and communicator who strives to help the public better understand the impact of the climate crisis. This is evident in her advocacy work as a co-founder of 500 Women Scientists, a global grassroots organization whose mission is to make science more inclusive and accessible, and through her media and popular works to spread the word about the climate crisis. She co-founded Hey Girl Productions, which produced the award-winning film The End of Snow, in which Dr. Zelikova stars in the film. She explores what is happening in areas that once relied on snow for recreation, livelihoods, water, and food, but is now facing a future without snow. The climate crisis is here. The time now is for action and solutions. Dr. Zelikova and her team are a part of those solutions and actions through their work. She is actually helping all of us learn more about being a better steward. And so help me welcome her as she comes to the podium.
Thank you. Okay. Hi, everybody. Yeah? Okay, hi. I am beyond honored to be here today. I really cherish this invitation. I'm so excited to talk to you about the work that I'm involved with at Colorado State University. I'm going to give a bit of a high-level overview of climate solutions and then deep dive into one particular one. Before I start, I want to say thank you for the students for having lunch with me today and for inviting me to come and speak on these topics. I know I'm going to be talking about climate change. It can be a little bit dark and triggering. I'll try to keep us moving. And I really appreciate how much emphasis there has been on 500 Women Scientists. It's an organization that is near and dear to my heart, and I'm really happy to see that you all picked up on that and have shared it. So check it out, 500womenscientists.org. Okay. So quick orientation of where we're going today. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the climate imperative and the role of carbon dioxide removal as kind of a suite of solutions. And then I'm going to use soil carbon dioxide removal as a particular case study by which I can talk about the suite of solutions available to us and then the sort of market and policy mechanisms as they're being applied to help those solutions scale and whether or not those solutions are actually achieving the desired goals, including regressing past harms and furthering equity and justice. So the climate imperative, I wouldn't be a climate change scientist if I didn't show a figure like this. You've probably seen figures like this before. So this is a very recent end of last year emissions gap report published end of 2023. And I love that the scientists who wrote this report have basically are fed up to the point where they're just saying, We're like a broken record. We publish this report every year. We talk about how much we need to be moving along in decarbonization and we're not there. So they called it the broken record report because, oh my God, they must be sick of it by now. And basically what graphs like this show is the current emissions trajectory we're on, is this blue line, including the current policies that are enacted today to reduce emissions. And then there's various scenarios that are shown, and we can see that if we want to limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius, this is what the emission trajectory should be. If we wanted to limit it to 1.5, this is what that trajectory should be. We're currently not on those trajectories, and the gap here is pretty significant. So this is the climate imperative. We have a lot of work to do. And another thing that's really clear at this point is that just reducing emissions isn't going to cut it. So there is now really clear evidence that we need to scale carbon dioxide removal, or we just call it carbon removal, as quickly as possible. So even if we reduce all of our emissions, we're still going to have to be actively pulling carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in order to limit warming to 2 or even 1.5 degrees. And so what this is saying is that we have these past emissions called legacy emissions we have to remove, and then we have to remove all the emissions we're still putting up into the atmosphere. And the estimate's about 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide removal required by the end of the century per year. So it's 10 gigatons that we need to be removing in addition to having already decarbonized. It's a big job. And so we have some different kinds of carbon dioxide removal, from things that are more, we'll call them natural. Sometimes they're referred to as nature-based climate solutions, natural climate solutions, basically harnessing the power of nature to do what nature does. And that could be coastal wetlands, forests, agriculture, deploying things like biochar, to what I would call engineered or high-tech carbon removal solutions. These could be pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere using direct air capture, which are these giant fans basically that pull air through, and then they have binding materials inside that have a high affinity for carbon dioxide. They bind it, and then you can heat it up and compress it and pump it into a geologic reservoir, for example. And there's things like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage that sit somewhere in the middle between nature and engineering. We grow plants, we burn them, we make energy, we capture the carbon dioxide, we pump it underground. So there's kind of a range of things we can do for carbon removal. And I focus my work on soil carbon here specifically in my research, but in my policy work, I work across all of these solutions. And I'll just say, this is the moment for soil. As someone who's been working on soil for a long time, it's been really heartening to see how much people have finally sort of appreciated this underappreciated resource literally under our feet. Lots and lots of papers have been published, popular media, films made about the potential for soils to help restore our relationship with the land and potentially restore climate change at the same time. And there's especially a lot of interest in agricultural soil carbon from agricultural producers themselves, farmers and ranchers who are managing these lands, and also lots and lots of companies, policymakers. You can't go a week without some high-level US policy person talking about soil carbon. And obviously there have been lots of activities in carbon markets, which I'll discuss in more detail. And just like with I wouldn't be a scientist if I didn't do this, but basically as interest in soil carbon is growing, so have the number of papers that have been published about soil carbon. So this is typical scientist behavior to write a paper about the number of papers that have been published about a topic. So you can see the number of papers have been rising dramatically on soil carbon sequestration and its relationship to soil, to climate mitigation or climate adaptation. So lots and lots of research coming out on this topic, which is good because we have a lot of questions that need answering. So how do we sequester carbon in soil? Well, actually, it's very hard. So the biggest thing that needs to happen is that plants grow in soils. Plants do photosynthesis. They take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and then they draw it down into the soil system, either directly through the roots or when they decompose and die. And so basically, the carbon enters the soil system in lots of different ways, as root exudates or directly as dissolved carbon forms as water flows through, and then bacteria and fungi, essentially your microbes in the soil, they do the major job of transforming all these different types of carbon into organic and inorganic forms that are then stored for 1 minute, 1 hour, 1 day, 1 week, etc., to hundreds of years, depending. And there's different kinds of carbon in the soil. It's not all created equal, and different types of carbon have longer or shorter residences time in the soil. And we can manage these systems, and especially manage how the plants are grown actively to get more carbon underground. That's our biggest tool, is managing the plants. And so what is the soil carbon drawdown potential? How much carbon can we sequester? With agriculture, well, there's kind of two things we can do. We can sequester carbon, or we can reduce the carbon that we're losing, aka reduce emissions. And we can do that by, in croplands, in grasslands, we can plant trees and do agroforestry. We can put down biochar, etc. And we can manage nutrients to reduce emissions. And you can see kind of the biggest bang for your buck. Obviously, if you plant trees, you get more carbon. Trees hold a lot of carbon. But there's quite a lot we can do if we manage croplands and grasslands and how much carbon we can sequester. And a lot of that comes with lots of co-benefits for biodiversity, for water quality, air quality, reducing soil erosion, and kind of improving climate resilience and sustainability more generally. So all of these awesome co-benefits help improve or sustain rural agricultural livelihoods, and can also improve food security as we're producing crop yields are decreasing with climate change. So there's potential for us to do climate mitigation at the same time supporting the people that grow our food. And so how much carbon can we draw down? Well, it kind of depends on where you are. This is a map of the US, and this is how much soil carbon can be sequestered. The darker areas are where we have more carbon sequestration potential. You can see the Midwest with its beautiful Midwestern soils. We can sequester a lot more carbon. Areas where I live in Colorado, and where y'all are, not as much. So it depends on where you are, and that potential is really variable, and it's also not indefinite. So if we look at how much carbon can be sequestered or put back into the soil system, at some point we hit a point at which we're no longer sequestering any more carbon. So soils get saturated, and different kinds of soils have different saturation points. So we can only cram so much carbon into a system. And saturation can occur even if you improve management. So this is a graph showing that if you do no-till or conventional tillage, even with conventional tillage, you are starting to hit asymptotes as you would with no-till. So even if you improve management, you just hit a saturation point a little bit higher. You're still gonna hit a saturation point. But I think in terms of where we have opportunities to do these things, it's anywhere that we can grow crops is an area where we could potentially improve soil management and get all those co-benefits as well as climate mitigation. So green areas are areas where we grow crops. Brown areas are where we graze animals or have pasture. And so the different tools that you would deploy depend on where you are and what you're doing, what type of management. Another thing to consider is that we've lost a lot of carbon already. So if we think about the intensive kind of management of agricultural systems, we're doing a lot of tilling, we're doing like intensive nutrient additions, etc. We've lost a lot of carbon already. We've lost a lot of soil. Think about a picture of the Dust Bowl, right? All that dust used to be soil, and it blew away or it washed away and it's gone. And with it, all the carbon that it held. And so we have a potential to put some of that carbon back. And so we can look at places that are kind of hotspots of where carbon's been lost. Hey, the Midwest is a hotspot. So is much of Western Europe, which has been doing intensive agriculture for thousands of years. Those are areas where we can do something to put some of that carbon back. And we also need to consider what types of management practices are in place. So when we make recommendations about the types of management that would improve soil carbon sequestration, what are the opportunities? So for example, in California, taken together, grassland, pasture, and crop constitute about 1/3 of your land use. So that's about a third of California's land that we could potentially manage for improved soil carbon sequestration. In Colorado, gosh, we use a lot of our land to graze cattle. That's kind of our biggest thing. And we also grow crops. So that's kind of the biggest bang for our buck here. Texas is similar, lots and lots of grazing animals. And so shifting management practices to help improve soil carbon and regenerate soil carbon have been shown to actually be effective. So from things like improving grazing to moving systems from low to high diversity agricultural systems to planting perennial grasses or grasses into agricultural systems. These things have shown to be pretty effective in terms of increasing soil carbon over time. But if you look at the number of years, it takes anywhere from, 8 to 38.5 years to see those effects. So it's not immediate. It's one of those kind of slow burn solutions. And so when we think about what we need to enable that shift to rebuilding soil carbon in these agricultural soils, we kind of need 3 big things. And just up here, there are 5 principles of regenerative agriculture that help us improve soil carbon and soil health more generally. Those are minimizing soil disturbance, so reducing tilling or eliminating tilling completely, maximizing crop diversity, so planting a diversity of crops helps bring a diversity of different kinds of carbon molecules into the microbial pool. And then when there's a diversity of microbes, they are pretty effective at creating some stable carbon. There's also keeping the soil covered, planting cover crops, and making sure that you have living roots in the ground year round. That means you're going to be doing photosynthesis year round, and that means there's a carbon pump going on all the time. And then the 5th thing is integrating livestock, putting some natural fertilizer back on the land. And so to enable this shift towards rebuilding carbon, in the US and in Europe at least, there have been kind of 3 major mechanisms. The first is markets, and especially people have been relying on either creating carbon markets or creating some sort of a price premium for products that are grown regenerative. So just by way of a show of hands, how many of you have seen regenerative something at the store? Like regenerative eggs that are like $10 for a dozen. I saw that recently and I was like, I don't know what this means. And I work on this stuff. And then there's also policy, a lot of policy in play right now, from the USDA giving out billions of dollars to enable climate smart agriculture, to state and local governments creating their own programs, to state and federal government procurement programs that are now essentially committing to buying regeneratively grown products or produce. And then the 3rd thing that's needed is just vision, because there are a lot of cultural barriers to implementing these things. And so there's kind of this cultural or internal transformation that has to happen within communities that often feel left out of climate stuff. And so even if we do markets perfectly, which we don't, even if we do policy perfectly, which we don't, we're not going to get anywhere if we don't tap into this idea of like a collective vision for something better and work with the communities that actually are tasked with doing this and managing the land. So I want to talk a little bit about markets, because I think this is one of those things where if you're in it, you understand that it's complicated, but if you're not in it, this is what a carbon market's like snapshot looks like. So I'm going to walk you a little bit through this because this is insane. So basically, over the last 5 years or so, there have been a bunch of different voluntary carbon markets that have been stood up. So this one is focused on materials and open ocean, long-lived products, above and below ground plant biomass, essentially trees, and then you have coastal and riverine biomass, and here's soil carbon. And so as we think about soil carbon, there's different options. There's agriculture, there's biochar, there's avoided grassland conversion, and then if you keep tracking it, these blue things are the voluntary carbon market registries that host the projects. And then you have all these different sort of like big programs that pay for carbon offsets or carbon credits. The point of this graph is just to show you that it's really complicated and convoluted and really difficult to understand, and I think that's by design, to keep people from asking too many sophisticated questions. Here's a little bit of a closer snapshot so you can see who are the players in these new carbon markets. So this is a snapshot from last year, and this is published on pure.earth so you can see it. Basically, you have a bunch of entities in this space, and it's good to understand what their different roles are and where they are at odds with each other. So on the buyer side, you have corporates. So when I flew here this morning, I flew on Southwest. Southwest Airlines provides the opportunity for you to buy carbon offsets to offset your flights. So they would be considered a corporate buyer of carbon credits. So when you buy an offset, they essentially pool all our money and buy on our behalf carbon offsets. And they don't always disclose what kind of carbon offsets they're buying. You have to dig into it. Another example, I get these diapers. They're made out of bamboo. They're compostable, I guess. And anytime I get a box with diapers in the mail, it says they've carbon neutral because they've offset whatever. And I've emailed the company several times to ask what offsets they buy, and I have not responded to my inquiries. So whatever they're buying, it's a black box. And then you have government entities, NGOs, universities, etc., buying carbon offsets. And then you have a bunch of decarbonization platforms where you can go and buy them yourself. So here's one, Choose, where you can go in and buy your own offsets if you are so inclined, etc. On this side, you have projects. Project proponents are people that are actually building carbon projects. So they're going out and creating a project by conserving a piece of forest or something like that. So you have project proponents, project developers. They're the people that are developing all these different projects. This doesn't even begin to cover the number of project developers there are. It's like an infinite number. And then you have various financial bodies that essentially give money to these project developers to finance or invest in their projects. And then you have all of these measurement, reporting, and verification companies because measuring carbon is really hard, so they offer a service to make it easier / credible. So that's a lot, right? And then you have some direct sales, people that are like literally selling directly to buyers. So an example of Climeworks, I just read this morning, Climeworks is a direct air capture company. They have these fan machines that literally pull CO2 out of the air, out of the atmosphere. They compress it and put it down into the ground in geologic reservoirs. It's not really a huge operation yet, so they've already pre-sold all of their credits through 2027. Anything that can generate has already been purchased. Now they just announced they're also going to be an aggregate of other credits. So they're not just going to be a maker of carbon credits, they're also going to pull carbon credits from other companies, bundle them into portfolios, and sell them to companies as portfolios. That's a thing. So then basically they're going to become one of these people in the middle. And the number of people in the middle is really a lot. And most of the money between the buy side and the supply side gets sucked up into the middle. There are a lot of entities here that get a cut from every carbon credit sold. So this is just kind of an overview of what's happening in the space. And none of this is regulated. There's no oversight. And so if we look at these kinds of projects, in the nature restoration, natural carbon credits kind of space, agricultural land management fetches about $10 to $70 a ton of carbon. That's actually pretty cheap. I have yet to see anybody really pay 70. It's probably closer like 10 to 40. But I guess there are some projects that are listed that go for 70, but I'm not sure if anybody's buying them. Just to compare, if we look at carbon engineering, the cost is 50 to over 100, biochar 10 to 60. Clean cook stoves are really cheap. In fact, most of the credits are these kinds of credits, clean cook stoves. But then you have, some of the other really cheap ones is like landfill, gas collection, waste management, and managing fugitive emissions can also release or generate carbon credits. So just to show you what the relative cost is. And this is the number of credits that were sold in 2021 to 2023. And the light green is your nature restoration credits that include agricultural land management. They're the bulk of the credits that are sold. So we call this charismatic carbon because a company that buys from these kinds of projects wants to be able to show nice pictures of forests that they're restoring or rural communities that are smiling because they're able to do things that they weren't able to do before. So charismatic carbon being things that you would send a camera crew to go record. A lot of those are in this nature restoration space because nature is nice. And so when we think about all of this that's going on, and there's no oversight and no governing body, some entities have come up with some rules to help us make sure that we hold some level of credibility or some level of rigor to this whole operation. And so Microsoft does a bunch of carbon credit buying, and they worked with a company called Carbon Direct to generate carbon credit quality criteria. So they're basically saying each project has to meet these criteria in order for us to say it's a high quality project and to recommend purchasing credits from this project. And it has to meet basic additionality and baseline rules, meaning that the project would not have occurred without the carbon finance. You have to show that you wouldn't have cut down that forest if you hadn't gotten that carbon payment. And that proving additionality is very challenging because how do you know if someone wasn't going to cut it? They could be like, I'm going to cut it. I'm going to cut it unless you give me some money. So it's a little bit like blackmail. So you have to show it. And then you have to set a rigorous baseline. And that baseline has to be reflective of what would have happened if you hadn't done the activity. How much carbon would have been sequestered on this landscape if you hadn't injected carbon finance into it? It's actually really hard to do because how do you get into people's heads and know what they were really going to do? And this leads to carbon accounting. How do we actually quantify how much carbon is being sequestered? How do we do that over time? How do we do that in places where it's hard to measure? For example, below ground. Soils continue to be a black box. You have to collect a lot of samples. It's really tricky. There's also this criterion around not doing harm. So you have to show that the project is not going to negatively impact the surrounding ecosystem or the surrounding communities. And I'll talk about a couple examples where that hasn't been met. And then you also have to show that the project is creating durable carbon storage, meaning those carbon molecules are going to get stored for some meaningful amount of time given the climate trajectory. So not 1 year, but let's say 100 years or 1,000 years. That's considered durable. And then there's the idea of leakage. And I think the best way to think about leakage is if I am to cut down this forest, so if I don't cut down this forest right here in front of me, and I'm going to conserve it, and I'm going to get paid carbon money for it, but the wood need is still there, and that means that outside of my project boundary, that forest gets cut. That's leakage. From a climate perspective, there is no climate benefit. So you have to account for the potential impacts of leakage. It's a really big deal for forestry projects because wood demand is going up. So you have to really show that the project is not going to change the demand. And so from the perspective of soil carbon, there's a paper that came out last year where they went through and looked at these major kind of things that we know we need to do. We need to be able to quantify soil carbon change. We need to make sure it's additional and permanent. And we have to consider leakage and sort of other issues. And then the perspective on whether we have the soil science, the management tools, and the governance in place to actually ensure that these things can happen. So I know it's really hard to read, so I'll just say what you can see is that on the governance side, it's either costly or difficult to prove or measure across all of these key areas. Meaning like we have no idea if there's any governance in place to ensure that these goals are being met. We also don't have the precision for soil carbon measurement to actually quantify these changes. And we're pretty uncertain about the permanence of the carbon that's being stored. And so there are some synergies and some good things that happen when we manage soils better, but from a carbon perspective, we just don't know. Not enough to issue a carbon credit anyway. And so I think it's worth spending just a couple of minutes thinking through all the different ways we measure soil carbon so you can understand why it's so hard. And this example of soil carbon can also relate to other nature-based or nature restoration types of approaches. So a key barrier to implementing programs that incentivize changes in soil carbon is just the fact that we don't have a reliable or scalable way to measure things. And the reason that we do that is because to measure soil carbon, we can do it 4 different ways. We can go out and sample. We can go out and dig a hole, collect samples, bring them back into the lab, and run them on our lab machines. How many of you have ever dug a hole to collect a sample? Many, many holes have been dug, right? It's not that it's hard. We know how to dig a hole. It's not that it's physically time consuming. And then you have to bring the samples back in the lab, and you have to run them using standard methods, which, separate conversation, different labs do different things. It affects the final number significantly. So we have to standardize how we do that. So that means this is pretty difficult to do enough samples, dig enough holes. We can also go out and put out towers or use drones or dig holes and put sensors in the ground to actually measure things in real time. Towers are expensive. Drones are kind of expensive, and embedded sensors are expensive, so it doesn't happen very much. We can also use satellites, but a really big question I have is, can we actually measure soil carbon from space? We can measure other things, and then we can build relationship between the things we can measure from space and other things, but those relationships are always going to be tenuous, and they're only going to tell us about the surface and not the carbon deep underground. We can also use models, and there are lots of different types of ecosystem or process-based or biogeochemical models. These are things I work on quite a lot, and all models are garbage, but some of them are useful. So the models are only as good as the data, and we don't have very good data. So people have been thinking a lot about this, and they're saying, we need to take a lot of samples to have confidence, and we can't. There's no one-size-fits-all sampling strategy. Different places require you to collect samples differently. We can't measure soil carbon from space, and we don't have any other rapidly deployable tools yet, which means this is just not game ready. And lots of people have been publishing papers to sort of show that it's not game ready. And yet, there are lots of soil carbon crediting protocols that will issue you soil carbon credits. So I think I told somebody, this is the one table that I actually authored. Everything else I'm presenting is other people's work. But a couple of years ago, I spent 3 months reading all of these soil carbon protocols. The brain damage done cannot be undone. It was a lot, and it wasn't very fun. But what we did is we ranked all of these different crediting protocols based on their rigor, how well they actually quantify things, based on how well they meet very basic additionality requirements. From a climate perspective, it has to be additional. Otherwise, it doesn't do anything. Durability, and then any other safeguards around ecosystems or communities. And then we gave them a check mark rating. And just like top line message, crediting protocols mostly suck across the board. There are a few that don't suck. The Australian measurement protocol doesn't suck, in part because it's not a voluntary, but it's a compliance mechanism. In the Australian system, they require these as part of the regulatory framework, and so the protocols are just much better. This B carbon protocol has never been used, and this Vera soil protocol has never been used and now has been incorporated into a different protocol because it was too rigorous. Nobody could do it. We also found that these soil carbon projects could deepen in existing inequities because there's an unequal distribution of benefits. There are a lot of farmers and ranchers who don't own the land. And so when they do management that improves the value of the land, they can sometimes actually work their land to the point where they raise the value or increase their own rent and are no longer being able to pay it. And so there's no distribution of benefits back to the non-owner operators from the owners for most of these projects. There's lots of non-additionality and leakage, and it's just another dimension of creating a commodity out of something that it should not be a commodity, potentially. And so again, Carbon Direct did an assessment of all of the projects that they review for their clients, and they looked at whether or not these projects passed review or not passed review. So light green is did not pass review. This green, this like, I don't know what to call this green. Like, what did you say?
Chartreuse.
Oh, chartreuse, I love it. Yeah. So likely to achieve most quality objectives, but uncertainties are still there. And then very few projects, dark green, actually meet all the criteria. And you can see this for nature-based solutions like afforestation and forest management, other nature-based solutions like soils. The bulk, for soils, 71% did not pass review. They were basically like, these are not quality, we do not recommend buying these. And the 29% that did pass review, to some extent, still had many uncertainties and risks. Just to say, like, these projects are not meeting some basic criteria outlined by Microsoft. And so the trouble with enthusiasm about high technical potentials for soils to remove carbon is that these potentials are going to be really constrained by social factors, including whether farmers want to change what they're doing day to day to offer a sink for the world's emissions. This is a quote from a paper that came out in 2022, where they surveyed a bunch of farmers to ask why they were or were not participating in carbon markets. So we have this issue where things are not rigorous, and we have this issue where farmers don't really want to do it. And so, again, just to reiterate, what do farmers think? Well, most farmers are aware of carbon markets. I do a lot of webinars for farmers, and they're very interested, but very few of them participate, 3% currently. And that's actually probably a number that's decreasing, and most don't want to participate without big changes to how these programs work. And these changes start with higher payments, and also getting credit for pre-existing practices. So if people have been doing good things for like 20 years, they're not allowed to participate in these programs right now, which is not really fair. But from a climate perspective, it's not additional. That's hard. And so when we think about producer considerations, we have to think about what motivates people to change, what gives them that vision to go from something they're doing today to something very different. And there's kind of three things. I mean, economics is definitely one. Farmers need to get paid for things. They need to have financial benefit. They're not going to take on additional work or additional risk if there isn't a payment. But there's also educational barriers. A lot of these practices are new to the farmers. Managing for soil carbon is different than managing for crop yield. And so they need to be able to de-risk these new practices, meaning sometimes they need a demonstration project nearby in a similar agricultural context, so they can be like, okay, I know how this works, I can do that on my land. But without de-risking it, it's too hard to implement really, really different things. And there's also co-benefits, be they environmental or social. And there is kind of this weird thing about being a part of a group that's doing something. And with the wide use of the internet by farmers and ranchers, they're very online. They kind of belong to this like culture of change, and it feels really good to belong to that group. And so social scientists have actually looked into this, and a lot of farmers and ranchers, once they start doing things and connect with others who are doing similar things online, they become this community, and then it keeps them from reverting back. So cultural change includes community. So another thing that farmers have expressed concern about is that these projects are very difficult and burdensome. So they express concerns about convoluted, burdensome, and unpredictable nature of receiving offset credits, and emphasize that they were implementing practices for their own business interests and sustainability concerns, not the financial incentive, the generation of carbon credits. So that's interesting if we think about motivations, what we assume motivates people versus what actually motivates them to change, but also to stay with a new change. And a lot of people are operating under the assumption that it's money, but for lots of farmers, it's not. So that's interesting to know. And then a lot of producers have sort of articulated this point. They were already going to be doing some of this anyway, so why not take the money if it's being given to them? Which is totally fine. It's not a problem, except for, from a climate perspective, it's not additional. That carbon was going to be drawn down anyway, right? So it's tricky. And so carbon offset credit payments for agricultural soil carbon sequestration are largely reaching farmers who are already implementing these beneficial practices or are already strongly interested in implementing them. And the payments for the offsets are seen as gravy on top, suggesting that these offset markets face strong challenges of ensuring true additionality essential to effective climate mitigation. So sorry, these are some really great papers that have come out in the last couple of years that have been social scientists that have gone in and worked with these farming and ranching communities to figure out how they're thinking about these things. Because surprise, no one ever asks them before these markets are stood up. And so I think it's worth in the last couple of minutes thinking about what if we do this poorly? Well, there are lots of other examples where things have been done poorly in other carbon market contexts. So one is even with soil carbon, there's a Northern Kenya grassland carbon project that last year got a lot of pushback because they were incentivizing different kinds of grazing in these Northern Kenyan pastoral landscapes, including changing how pastoralists were living in communities, how they're moving around the landscape, and sort of like breaking up traditional pastoral communities and their interactions with each other for the benefit of carbon credit programs. Another is, here's another recent, this came out in November 2023. These are traditional people being evicted from their traditional lands in order to make room for carbon programs. And then there's this burner of an article that came out last year in the New Yorker, if you have a subscription, that's basically like lifting the hood on how these carbon market companies operate. And it's like, it's a really troubling landscape in which people don't really care about climate outcomes, but treat it as like an investment platform. Kind of this idea of like move fast, break things. But we can't move fast and break things when it comes to climate. I mean, we shouldn't anymore, I guess. And so there are some lessons from forestry where people have gone back and looked at rainforest carbon offset programs and showed that the majority of this one particular Vera program, the majority of the credits were worthless, didn't actually do anything from a climate perspective. Another study that looked at California offset program and saw that there's about 29 to 30% overcrediting, meaning that they're producing 30% more credits than they actually should be producing, given the activities that are taking place. And so I kind of want to end the carbon offset section with asking this question: are carbon offsets the labradoodle of climate solutions? Are they just this fad? They're really cute and they make us feel good, but are they actually achieving any climate benefits? That's maybe where the labradoodle analogy stops. Or putting it another way, is a transactional carbon credit tail wagging the virtuous soil organic matter dog? I love it when scientists come up with really good paper titles. But just to wrap it up, it's not just about the carbon. There are real people that are impacted by these projects. And we have to think beyond just a carbon molecule. And so studies that focus on socioeconomic issues often tend to overlook questions of representation and recognition by perpetuating the unexamined assumptions embedded in dominant cultural frameworks. There's nothing more dominant than a cultural framework that puts capitalism first, right? And so when we do that, we overlook all kinds of things that matter. Mainstream economic theory tends to overlook the structural legacies of systemic and historic exploitation and marginalization driven from colonialism and slave trade, which manifest in its economic parameters, assumptions, and choices of what is to be valued and in what terms. So when we start to create commodities of carbon and we start to prioritize the needs of carbon projects, we're just continuing to perpetuate the same systems that have created a lot of harm to begin with. And so getting it right might be thinking about resilience and adaptation. So for example, in agriculture, rather than focusing on creating a carbon credit, we can think about building more resilient ecosystems, agricultural ecosystems. So I love this agroecology minus politics equals regenerative agriculture. People are now talking a lot about regenerative agriculture, but regenerative agriculture is just agroecology, but agroecology is very radical because it includes the idea that politics matter and that we have to dismantle the systems that oppress us. So when we think about things in the frame of agroecology, we have to think about land tenure regimes. Who owns the land? Who is managing the land? Who is getting the profit? We have to think about power relationships. We can't ignore these things. We've ignored them for too long. It doesn't really get us anywhere. We have to really think about the power structures. And right now, these kinds of frameworks are not integrated into our modeled futures. If we look at graphs like this, they're based on integrated assessment models or biogeochemical models or ecosystem models or global climate models. They don't take into account what does it mean to do things from a perspective of justice. What does it mean to reduce emissions? Well, actually, reducing emissions in some places reduces people's ability to meet their basic needs. Much of the world is still living without electricity, right? And so a justice framework could be a really useful thing for us to implement as we think about implementing any kind of climate solution, soil carbon certainly being one of them. And so what would it look like to embed justice principles into how we proceed with climate solutions? Well, we have to include procedural justice, and that means fairness in decision making. Most carbon or climate solution types of projects currently are made by the same people, the same sort of industries, and the same people that have been in power for the last 50 to 100 to 200 years. And so there's not really fairness in decision making right now. I'll tell you this much, farmers don't get a say in carbon projects on their land. Distributive justice means equitable allocation of risks, benefits, and impacts. Right now, farmers are asked to take most of the risk. Most of the benefits go to the carbon programs and carbon markets and project developers who keep most of the money. And there's reparative justice, which people don't really even know how to think about yet, but that means that as we move forward, we have to build things in a way that regresses past harms. We can't just assume that we're good. We have to regress the harms that have already taken place and then move forward to minimize additional harm. And so scaling soil carbon as a climate solution justly would mean that we have to do community engagement. And that means continued, not one-off. You don't get to hold one community meeting and call it good. Because we have to remember that all these soil carbon projects take place within existing communities where there are people, there are relationships. We also have to ensure there's transparency, and that's transparency around the risks, the benefits for soil carbon projects contracting. I've talked to a bunch of farmers who are not allowed to share their contracts that they've signed with these carbon programs. They sign NDAs in addition to signing their contracts. That's a problem because then we don't really know what they're on the hook for, right? And we also have to address harms, acknowledge past harms, ensure there's structures in place to ensure we don't continue to harm people. In agriculture, one thing I never hear people talk about is safety for the worker, safety for people who are doing the work on the fields. Often they're immigrant labor, migrant labor. They might not have access to healthcare, et cetera. So we have to ensure that we're thinking and talking about that in a way that actually is meaningful for the people it impacts. And so when we talk about environmentally just carbon dioxide removal technologies, we have to make sure that we're thinking about everything and everyone that goes into the project. That includes, but is not limited to, the people, policies, processes, communication, transparency, impacts, environmental impacts, health impacts, economic and more, and decision making. So it's really hard. Doing these things in a just way is really hard. It's really slow. You have to have a lot of people in the room. It's really hard to make decisions with lots of people in the room. So people just take the easy way. But we have to do it this other way, I think. And so what that means is that we have these technical sequestration potentials where we think, okay, we can sequester this much carbon. But if we think about how much of that can we do in a way that is just, that is going to be a much smaller number, right? And so if we want to have soil carbon or climate solutions with impact, we have to do three things. And we have to make this moment count because 1, the climate imperative is real. 2, people are so excited about soil. We don't want to let that moment go to waste. As someone who's worked on soil for a long time, it's like, I don't know how many more years people are going to be excited, and then they're going to forget about it. So let's make this moment count. We have to focus on producers and building regenerative production systems, not just carbon projects. We have to create incentives that are fostering just outcomes for all and solving actual problems. Building a new software for enabling a soil carbon project might be a good idea, but it's not solving a real problem for the people on the ground. And then we want to make sure there's scientific rigor to ensure that the climate benefits are real. And so I'll just leave you with these two quotes from two people I admire deeply. We need courage, not hope. Courage is the resolve to do well without the assurance of a happy ending. That's what we need for climate. And as Marian S. Hegler says, do what you're good at and do your best. And I'll end with that. Thank you.
So I really like what you said about justice, but you also said that it's slow, and time is of the essence. So how do we deal with this problem of we don't have a lot of time to fix a problem that's like going off a cliff, but the answer is to do it slow?
Yeah, I don't have an answer for that. That's a really good question. I think about what if we do it quickly. There have been lots of moments in history where we're like, we gotta go fast. It doesn't matter what we break as we're going fast because we have a bigger goal at the end, and we never really get to that goal, right? It's never durable, it's never gonna stick. So, I don't know. If we wanna go fast, we have to go together. Some proverb that I don't know. I don't know the answer. Anyone else have an answer for that? If we can solve that, then we can solve everything.
There are many solutions, many approaches to the solution, and soil is one of them. What kind of mix do you foresee would be the best one in the next, speed things up and to bring things going, get things going?
Okay, in my dream scenario, we would manage every acre of land optimally for agricultural, ecosystem, and carbon outcomes. But what that means for any given acre depends. So in some places we use biochar, in some places we plant cover crops, in some places we put in trees, etc. We put direct air capture machines on our buildings, and we put the pipes into our HVAC systems, and we have pipelines under our cities that go into geologic storage sequestration. We use sustainable biomass to generate power, to power processes that can't be electrified in other ways. Every industrial process is required to use carbon capture and storage. We replace plastics with bio materials, so we don't have to use petroleum. We keep eating cows if we want to, but we have lots of other protein sources to displace some of the methane emissions that come from livestock. God, I can just keep going. There's this world that we can imagine where these things work, and we don't live in that world now.
Yes, thank you for your presentation today. I think that in one of the slides you talked about the farmers, they don't have any input. So if you had all the resources in the world, how would you help these farmers? What would you say to them? And how would you get them on the table so that they have more bargaining power?
I would say you don't need to work, you don't have to participate in a carbon program. There are easier ways to get farmers to do things. One is to have large-scale government programs that incentivize particular production systems. Currently, the government has that. Crop insurance, for example, is a giant program that all farmers participate in. Crop insurance doesn't apply to many climate-smart practices, locking farmers into particular practices, even if they don't want to use them anymore, because of crop insurance programs. So I would say there are easier levers, more efficient ways to get farmers to do things from a financial incentive perspective. But carbon markets are probably not the most efficient lever for that outcome. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. And I guess as one follow-up, I also know some people who are farmers and they say they don't really have a favorable view of the government as well.
Yeah.
So I guess based on what you just said, would that kind of alleviate their fears of the government or dislike of the government?
That's real. Most farmers do not have a favorable view of the government, and they definitely do not want the government to have their data. One really big issue is with data, and so even if they're participating in government programs, they want private entities to get the data. So there are some things to resolve there, and farmers of color have an even larger distrust of the government, as they should, because they have been mistreated by the US government quite a lot. So it's a really big issue to resolve, but I think that we should be just as mistrustful of carbon market companies. It's just that they're newer and untested.
So between methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorocarbons, I just wanted to ask, whether you think carbon dioxide is more of a prevalent issue than like what those other greenhouse gases cause, or whether mitigating carbon dioxide will help with those in any way.
Great question. That is the holy trinity of greenhouse gases. Some people I work with would say, yes, like methane's kind of a problem, but it still only sticks around for 20 years. And so we should be really thinking about CO2 molecules, because those stick around for much, much longer and have a longer runway for heat trapping, even though the heat trapping of a methane molecule is greater in the short term. Those are less of a concern. Other people think it should be everything and we should get everything off the table as quickly as possible. I fall in the camp of there are, for some of those, like nitrous oxide is a really big deal, and I didn't talk about it, but there are some hotspots of nitrous oxide emissions from agriculture that are really, really problematic, and you can do the best you can at reducing CO2 emissions, and you negate that all with nitrous oxide. But at least with nitrous oxide emissions, we have some things we can do, like reduce nutrient inputs, etc. Whereas with CO2 emissions into the atmosphere from other industries, less from agriculture, we just don't have, there are not really good pathways to reduce CO2 for some industries. And so I guess I less worry about methane than I do about CO2.
So thank you very much, Jane. You had some really great points, and this question is kind of related to the critics of, so there are some people who, surprisingly, some of these are scientists, they claim that carbon emission is actually good for plants. They claim that, it helps with the photosynthesis and it helps the growth of plants. So how would you sort of argue with these scientists that claim that, it's good for the growth of plants?
I wouldn't argue they're right. I published a paper on that. Plants grow better when you give them more CO2, especially C3 plants, because it makes them more efficient at photosynthesis. That doesn't mean more CO2 in the atmosphere is better for plants across the board, because heat stress is bad for plants. So there's a trade-off between how much carbon dioxide you can give them to improve photosynthesis and how much more water they need in order to survive in a hot, hot world. So they're not wrong. They're just barking up the wrong tree, but they're not wrong.
Hello, Jen. So the question is, you talked about when you actually sequester that or trap it or suck it out of the atmosphere and bury it down in geological, reserves. This is the same thing, of course, the plants doing it just temporarily. The permanent one will be when you form limestone. So has there been any data about what they are burying and what it's really turning into and how permanent that is? Because that's really what's going to make a real, takeaway.
For soil carbon?
In other words, the lifetime in that story.
Oh man, okay. So there are these things that are happening now where people are developing microbes that accelerate the process of creating soil inorganic carbon, which is like calcium carbonate, limestone-like carbon that'll stick around for a long time. People are applying rock dust from things like olivine and basalts, more generally depending on where you are, into farmland to help capture more carbon and then essentially through the water pathway get it into the ocean eventually. Questions about how long that takes and whether or not we can measure that adequately. People are developing weird crop varieties that can mineralize carbon in the soil more quickly in their roots, forming long-lasting carbon sort of molecules and aggregates. People are trying to get certain plants to catalyze the creation of mineral-associated organic matter, meaning like microbial biomass that gets stuck to to soil particles and gets stored for hundreds to thousands of years. So there are lots of different sort of pathways to try to figure that out. People are trying to create plant varieties and crop varieties that have roots that don't decompose, which I think is kind of a problem, but maybe could work. So there are different people trying to hack different parts of the system to essentially create more durable carbon. But you're right, 90% or more of the carbon that is coming into the system goes back out. So we need to increase the inputs and decrease the output in order to actually grow the pool. And we can do lots of different things to do that, and none of those are fully resolved scientifically yet.
I love that talk. It's great. It shows the complexity of measures that are being undertaken or planned. But Elizabeth Colbert gave a talk here some years ago. Some of you may remember her. And when she gave that talk, she ended the presentation with these words. I would like to tell you that the future is bright. The pause is important, but it's not. Those of us that have studied the climate solutions, and you've illustrated very well how complex it is and how faulty the individual components are, especially with the underlying economic paradigm with which we as individuals and corporations work. Dare I ask, do you share that vision?
The future might be bright, but ... It's not? Oh, okay. Working on carbon markets has darkened my vision from positive to less positive because of the obvious economic incentive structures that are causing a lot of harm. However, I work in a space where lots and lots of people are bringing their passion and expertise and ingenuity to the problem and trying to come up with all kinds of ways to fix it. And so I would say the future is bright, not because the solutions we have on the table are gonna solve anything. We have no silver bullets, no line of sight for silver bullets. But man, oh man, do we have a lot of people fighting the good fight. Thank you.
In a not-so-distant past, in a land not so far away, we find our hero entering a cold, mysterious land. Surrounded by white-capped giants and lakes full of deep, old secrets, she is on a quest for the story of snow. For as the sun shines bright and we become ever more industrious, winter has begun her retreat. On her journey, our adventurer traverses mountains and braves the elements. She searches for the oracle, the one who sees the changes coming. She finds the snow guardian, who's watched many winters come and go. As winter fades, our hero seeks the visionaries, rising up to face our thirsty tomorrow. Her adventure brings new friends, and she even finds time for a little fun. Because it is when we set out upon the unknown with open hearts and minds that we find hope for the future. A map for living in a world beyond the end of snow.